Section 7. The Struggle for the Normal Working Day. Reaction of the English Factory Acts on Other Countries. The reader will bear in mind that the production of surplus value, or the extraction of surplus labor, is the specific end and aim, the sum and substance of capitalist production, quite apart from any changes in the mode of production which may arise from the subordination of labor to capital. You will remember that as far as we have at present gone, only the independent laborer, and therefore only the laborer legally qualified to act for themselves, enters as a vendor of a commodity, their own labor power, with the capitalist. If, therefore, in our historical sketch, on the one hand modern industry, on the other the labor of those who are physically and legally minors, play important parts, the former was to us only a special department, and the latter only a specially striking example of labor exploitation. Without, however, anticipating the subsequent development of our inquiry, from the mere connection of the historic facts before us, it follows, first, the passion of capital for an unlimited and reckless extension of the working day is first gratified in the industries earliest revolutionized by water power, steam, and machinery in those first creations of the modern mode of production: cotton, wool, flax, and silk spinning and weaving. The changes in the material mode of production and the corresponding changes in the social relations of the producers gave rise first to an extravagance beyond all bounds, and then in opposition to this called forth a control on the part of society which legally limits, regulates, and makes uniform the working day and its pauses. Quoting the reports for the 31st October 1848, the conduct of each of these classes, capitalists and workpeople, has been the result of the relative situation in which they have been placed. Unquote. This control appears, therefore, during the first half of the 19th century simply as exceptional legislation. Quoting the reports again, this time for 1864, the employments placed under restriction were connected with the manufacture of textile fabrics by the aid of steam or water power. There were two conditions to which an employment must be subject to cause it to be inspected, viz., the use of steam or water power and the manufacture of certain specified fiber. Unquote. As soon as this primitive dominion of the new mode of production was conquered, it was found that in the meantime not only had many other branches of production been made to adopt the same factory system, but that manufactures with more or less obsolete methods, such as potteries, glass-making, etc., that old-fashioned handicrafts like baking, and finally even that the so-called domestic industries, such as nail-making, had long since fallen as completely under capitalist exploitation as the factories themselves. Legislation was therefore compelled to gradually get rid of its exceptional character, or where, as in England, it proceeds after the manner of the Roman casuists, to declare any house in which work was done to be a factory. Quoting the reports for 1864, the Acts of last session, 1864, embrace a diversity of occupations, the customs in which differ greatly, and the use of mechanical power to give motion to machinery is no longer one of the elements necessary, as formerly, to constitute, in legal phrase, a, quote, factory, unquote. Second, the history of the regulation of the working day in certain branches of production, and the struggle still going on in others in regard to this regulation, prove conclusively that the isolated laborer, the laborer as free vendor of their labor power, when capitalist production has once attained a certain stage, succumbs without any power of resistance. The creation of a normal working day is, therefore, the product of a protracted civil war, more or less dissembled, between the capitalist class and the working class. As the contest takes place in the arena of modern industry, it first breaks out in the home of that industry, England. Footnote, Belgium, the paradise of continental liberalism, shows no trace of this movement. Even in the coal and metal mines, laborers of both sexes and all ages are consumed in perfect, quote, freedom at any period and through any length of time. Of every 1,000 persons employed there, 733 are men, 88 women, 135 boys, and 44 girls under 16. In the blast furnaces, etc., of every 1,000, 668 are men, 149 women, 98 boys, and 85 girls under 16. Add to this the low wages for the enormous exploitation of mature and immature labor power. The average daily pay for a man is 2 shillings 8 pence, for a woman 1 shillings 8 pence, for a boy 1 shilling 2.5 pence. As a result, Belgium had in 1863, as compared with 1850, nearly doubled both the amount and the value of its exports of coal, iron, etc. Back to the main text. The English factory workers were the champions not only of the English, but of the modern working class generally, as their theorists were the first to throw down the gauntlet to the theory of capital. Footnote, Robert Owen, soon after 1810, not only maintained the necessity of a limitation of the working day in theory, but actually introduced the 10 hours day into his factory at New Lanark. This was laughed at as a communistic utopia. So were his combination of children's education with productive labor, and the cooperative societies of workingmen first called into being by him. Today, the first utopia is a factory act. The second figures as an official phrase in all factory acts. The third is already being used as a cloak for reactionary humbug. Back to the main text. Hence, the philosopher of the factory, Ure, denounces as an ineffable disgrace to the English working class that they inscribed the slavery of the factory acts on the banner which they bore against capital, manfully striving for, quote, perfect freedom of labor. France limped slowly behind England. The February Revolution was necessary to bring into the world the 12 Hours Law, which is much more deficient than its English original. Footnote, in the Compte Rendu of the International Statistical Congress at Paris, 1855, it is stated, quote, the French law, which limits the length of daily labor in factories and workshops to 12 hours, does not confine this work to definite fixed hours. For children's labor, only the work time is prescribed as between 5 a.m. and 9 p.m. Therefore, some of the masters use the right, which this fatal silence gives them, to keep their works going, without intermission, day in, day out, possibly with the exception of Sunday. For this purpose, they use two different sets of workers, of whom neither is in the workshop more than 12 hours at a time, but the work of the establishment lasts day and night. The law is satisfied, but is humanity? Unquote. Besides, quote, the destructive influence of night labor on the human organism, stress is also laid upon, quote, the fatal influence of the association of the two sexes by night in the same badly lighted workshops, unquote. Back to the main text. For all that, the French revolutionary method has its special advantages. It once and for all commands the same limit to the working day in all shops and factories without distinction, whilst English legislation reluctantly yields to the pressure of circumstances, now on this point, now on that, and is getting lost in a hopelessly bewildering tangle of contradictory enactments. Footnote, quoting from the report of Mr. Baker in Reports for October 1st, 1861, for instance, there is within my district one occupier who, within the same curtilage, is at the same time a bleacher and dyer under the Bleaching and Dyeing Works Act, a printer under the Print Works Act, and a finisher under the Factory Act, unquote. After enumerating the different provisions of these acts and the complications arising from them, Mr. Baker says, quote, it will hence appear that it must be very difficult to secure the execution of these three acts of Parliament where the occupier chooses to evade the law, unquote. But what is assured to the lawyers by this is lawsuits. Back to the main text. On the other hand, the French law proclaims as a principle that which in England was only one in the name of children, minors, and women, and has been only recently, for the first time, claimed as a general right. Footnote, thus the factory inspectors at last venture to say, quote, these objections of capital to the legal limitation of the working day must succumb before the broad principle of the rights of labor. There is a time when the master's right in his workman's labor ceases, and his time becomes his own, even if there were no exhaustion in the question, unquote. Back to the main text. In the United States of North America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed so long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin where in the black it is branded. But out of the death of slavery a new life at once arose. The first fruit of the Civil War was the 8 Hours agitation, that ran with the 7-leagued boots of the locomotive from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from New England to California. The General Congress of Labor at Baltimore on August 16, 1866 declared, quote, the first and great necessity of the present to free the labor of this country from capitalistic slavery is the passing of a law by which 8 hours shall be the normal working day in all states of the American Union. We are resolved to put forth all our strength until this glorious result is attained, unquote. And quoting the resolution of the working men of Dunkirk, New York State, 1866, we, the workers of Dunkirk, declare that the length of time of labor required under the present system is too great, and that, far from leaving the worker time for rest and education, it plunges them into a condition of servitude but little better than slavery. That is why we decide that 8 hours are enough for a working day, and ought to be legally recognized as enough. Why we call to our help that powerful lever, the press, and why we shall consider all those that refuse us this help as enemies of the reform of labor and of the rights of the laborer. unquote. At the same time, the Congress of the International Workingmen's Association at Geneva, on the proposition of the London General Council, resolved that, quote, the limitation of the working day is a preliminary condition without which all further attempts at improvement and emancipation must prove abortive. The Congress proposes 8 hours as the legal limit of the working day, unquote. Thus, the movement of the working class on both sides of the Atlantic that had grown instinctively out of the conditions of production themselves endorsed the words of the English factory inspector R.J. Saunders, quote, further steps toward a reformation of society can never be carried out with any hope of success unless the hours of labor be limited and the prescribed limit strictly enforced, unquote. It must be acknowledged that our laborer comes out of the process of production other than they entered. In the market, they stood as owner of the commodity labor power, face to face with other owners of commodities, dealer against dealer. The contract by which they sold to the capitalist their labor power proved, so to say, in black and white, that they disposed of themselves freely. The bargain concluded, it's discovered that they were no free agent, that the time for which they are free to sell their labor power is the time for which they are forced to sell it. That, in fact, the vampire will not lose its hold on them so long as there is a muscle, a nerve, a drop of blood to be exploited. That's quoting Engels. And quoting the reports for April 30, 1850, the proceedings, the maneuvers of capital, e.g. from 1848 to 1850, have afforded, moreover, incontrovertible proof of the fallacy of the assertion so often advanced that operatives need no protection but may be considered as free agents in the disposal of the only property which they possess, the labor of their hands and the sweat of their brows, unquote. Quoting the reports for 1864, free labor, if so it may be termed, even in a free country, requires the strong arm of the law to protect it, unquote. And quoting from the April 1863 reports, to permit, which is tantamount to compelling, to work 14 hours a day, with or without meals, etc. So commenting, Marx is making the point here that if the capitalists are legally allowed to do something, they have the power to arrange it so that basically that will be compulsory or mandatory for anybody working within their system. Continuing, for protection against the serpent of their agonies, the laborers must put their heads together, and as a class, compel the passing of a law, an all-powerful social barrier that shall prevent the very workers from selling, by voluntary contract with capital, themselves and their families into slavery and death. Footnote, the 10 Hours Act has, in the branches of industry that come under it, quote, put an end to the premature decrepitude of the former long-hour workers, unquote. Quote, capital in factories can never be employed in keeping the machinery in motion beyond a limited time without certain injury to the health and morals of the laborers employed, and they are not in a position to protect themselves, unquote. That's from the reports for October 1859. Back to the main text. In place of the pompous catalogue of the inalienable rights of man comes the modest Magna Carta of a legally limited working day, which shall make clear, quote, when the time which the worker sells is ended and when their own begins, unquote. What a great change from that time. And that's the end of the main text of section 7 and of chapter 10 as a whole. There is one last footnote, quote, a still greater boon is the distinction at last made clear between the worker's own time and their master's. The worker knows now when that which they sell is ended and when their own begins, and by possessing a sure foreknowledge of this, is enabled to prearrange their own minutes for their own purposes, unquote. These are from the reports for 1859. Quote, by making them masters of their own time, the factory acts have given them a moral energy which is directing them to the eventual possession of political power, unquote. With suppressed irony and in very well-weighed words, the factory inspectors hint that the actual law also frees the capitalist from some of the brutality natural to a person who is a mere embodiment of capital, and that it has given them time for a little culture. Quote, formerly, the master had no time for anything but money. The servant had no time for anything but labor, unquote.